In this video, I want to talk about the activity life cycle. It's important to understand how activities are launched and at what time they can go into the background or be shut down completely. So when we talk about the activity life cycle, we're talking about what happens to the activity class as a user navigates through your app in and out, if they answer a phone call, or if they switch to another app to look something up. We need to understand what happens, and there are a number of events that get dispatched that you can listen for and then respond accordingly. If you search for the activity life cycle on developer.android.com, you'll come across this article. And then we have this image here. I want to zoom in on it, so I've opened it up here. Let me just zoom in a little bit. So to read this, what happens is the activity launches. We call the onCreate method, and then it goes to the onStart, and then finally it passes through onResume, and the activity is running. When another activity comes in the foreground, then this activity that was running is then set. The on pause is called, and then immediately on stop is called. Now the activity is no longer visible. In the pause state, if you quickly go back to the app, then we call the on resume, and then the app continues to run. If you're in the on stop state and the user goes back to your activity, this particular activity, then it calls on restart, and then it goes back to on start through on resume and activity. If the activity is stopped, then apps with higher priority, if the process gets killed and then they go back to your activity, then it goes all the way back to the beginning on the on create. If the activity is finished or is being destroyed by another on the system, it calls on destroy. Basically, when the system needs more memory, it's going to call on destroy, and then the activity is shut down, at which point it would start all over. Now, it's a little difficult to understand what's going on, but let's run an app, and we'll talk through how we can see each one of these callbacks in action. Now, let's start by going to Android Studio. Let's create a new project, and we're just going to call this Lifecycle, and choose next, and then choose next. And let's go ahead and just choose basic activity. Just give us a template with something in it, and choose next. We'll go with the defaults and click finish. If we take a look at the main activity class, which is already open over here, or you go into your app and to the package and then choose main activity, you'll notice that we have onCreate, and onCreate is always required. You have to have onCreate within your activity class. These other options here, onCreate options menu, relates to the menu up in the top right corner. And if you select an item, then something happens here. So these are not related to the life cycle of the activity, but we're talking about the onCreate method. Now, one thing we need to do is, in order to know, or to, in other programming languages, you would have, print statements, or you would have nslog, or some way to log to the console and the developer console that runs when an app is running that the user won't see, and you want to be able to print out the value of certain things, or the certain state that an object is in. And so Android provides a way of doing that with the log class. And I'm going to show you, if we go back, I was showing this other tab here, write and view logs with logcat. So you can take a look, search for this, and get a little more involved. But basically, the way it works is you say log dot, and then you have a priority, which determines how it shows up in the console. And you have verbose, debug, info, warning, error, and assert. And then it prints out kind of a format. And we use the logcat monitor. And I'll show you that right now. Let's go back to Android Studio. And the first thing we want to do is in the onCreate method, we can go ahead and enter, and we start typing, and we say log, and then I'm going to press tab, and that's going to import. You probably didn't see this, but now it's going to import. Now I can use log, and now I can choose the string for the priority. And in this case, I want it to be I, which is information, because it's not an error. I'm not throwing an error. In this instance, I'm just, you can use information or debug. If you go back here, remember there's a few different choices. Let me show. It says the log level verbose is, and debug, info, warning. So this kind of shows priority when it shows up in the logcat. We'll get to that in a second. Again, we can see that we have a few options: verbose, debug, info, warning. We can use debug or info. It doesn't really matter at this point. We'll filter for the messaging. I'll show you that in a second. So let's go back to the project. And then we're going to say, let's just do debug. And then finally, it's expecting a tag, which is a string, and then the message itself. Now, we want to use, the reason we use a tag is so that you can identify which activity or which app is calling this. And it's a way, it's another level of indicating where this message is coming from. And typically, we create a static string that represents our tag. And so, for example, I'll just call this Lifecycle tag. It's not been created yet because it's, notice how it's showing red. And then the message, and I'm just going to say on create called. And finally, let's create this string. This will be a private static final string, and we're going to call this Lifecycle tag, and then that's going to equal, we'll just call it the name of this activity, which is main activity. All right, so let's go ahead and run this app and see how it behaves. We can create and select an emulator or on device, and we're going to proceed without instant run. Now down here we have the logcat, and if you open that, it's going to connect to whatever device is showing. At the moment the emulator is loading up, but now notice it kicked in, and all right, this is going by pretty quick. You see what's happening then is this is logcat of everything that's going on in this emulator, or if it were the device. So over here you have a lot of messaging going on. Now we want to filter that. So if you come over here, you can check the level, the log level, and filter. So we set this at debug. And so now this is all the debug messages. The only thing is that we still, we say show only selected application. And finally what you can do is select or filter the by tag. And so you could say main activity. So if I select and I type main activity, then now I'm seeing only the message. So there is the onCreate called. All right, very good. So we know then that the lifecycle, there are a number of methods that get called. So let's go ahead and add a few of those and identify when they get called and what happens. Now, if you start typing, you're going to see a reference to, and it'll show you, it's maybe a little difficult to see, but this is referencing OnStart. So if I type that, it automatically imports that method for me, and it adds the override. And so there's my OnStart. So here I can say log d lifecycle tag, and then for this message I can say OnStart called. Let's go ahead and copy this since we're going to do this a few more times. If we go back to our diagram, we have onCreate, we have onStart, we have onResume. So let's go back. Let's go ahead and add onResume, and then we're going to paste. Let's copy and paste that one more time. Wait. And we'll change the message. I kept pressing the wrong button. It's over here opening all these shortcuts because I can't find my keys. All right. So this is onResume. It's called. What else? OnResume. We also have onRestart, which can happen. So let's check out whoops. Let me put that back up here. OnRestart. And we'll update that. And then finally, let's look at these others. On pause, stop, and destroy. On pause. Let me just type these out before I forget. On stop and on destroy. Okay, now let's add our log message. And on destroy. Okay, let's stop any previously running things and let's run this one. Okay, immediately we had onCreate called, onStart, onResume. Awesome. Now let's, and again, notice I still have the filter on. I had it set to debug and I was filtering against main activity, or main as it shows up here. Now let's exit the app. And so it was on pause, destroy, stop, and then destroy. Notice that it was on destroy because I used the back button and essentially exited the app. All right, let's launch it one more time so that we can see. Let's see if we can get these other events. Again, you may not always go through all of these events, but we'll talk about what we do within each event so we understand how and why we need to pay attention to them. All right, let's launch here. So this time I'm going to show previous. Now it went to, notice how it said on pause and then on stop. So it went to the background, but it didn't get destroyed. And so then I go back, then it says on start, on resume. And I believe that's all of them. So we have, let's make sure. So we've got on create, obviously, on start, on resume. We got on pause, on stop, on restart. And then finally, on pause, stop, and then destroy. All right, so let's go ahead and stop this. Let's talk about what happens, why would we use them. On create, we talked about before, represents the visual elements that show up for this activity. And so this is the point at which the visual things get created and initialized. On create immediately is followed by on start. And on start, you can handle it, you can identify this on start is calls as soon as it becomes visible to the user. On create happens behind the scenes before it's visible, and then on start becomes visible. This is immediately followed by the on resume, at which point the app is visible. And when you're dealing with on start, you could also, we know that the visual elements are initialized and available. You could update the UI again, or you could add listeners and do some other follow-up on that. And immediately goes into on resume. Now the on resume is something that happens from on start, but also if we get the on pause means that the activity is now in the background. It still might be visible on the screen, where, for example, you're taking, you get a message or a phone call, and then it goes to pause, or like we were showing on that emulator. When that happens, you want to stop or pause any activity, things that are running visually, any animations, also dealing with anything that's broadcasting or sending messages to other activities, you would pause. When you hit the on resume, that's when you would reinitialize whatever you had paused. So those two come somewhat related. When we talk about on stop, this happens when the activity is completely off screen and can happen before it gets destroyed. Notice, remember, it called on stop before it was on destroyed. Here, then, you would take the time to do things to save the state or save to the disk on the device in order to shut down everything completely. On pause is more to deal with releasing things that are actively running, like if you were connected to the camera, or if you were listening for GPS, for example. During on pause, you would release those, and then on stop, when this gets called, that's when you would want to save data right to the disk, do things that are happening behind the scenes that won't interrupt what's on screen, because the activity is off screen and is about to be destroyed. All right. On restart gets called if the activity is not destroyed but comes back. So you recall again with our little diagram, we hit on stop, and then if the activity is not going to be destroyed but it goes to on start, on restart, then back on to start, you could then begin to reload things that you had stopped previously. All right. So that gives you an idea of the life cycle. We'll be using and referencing a number of these as we get involved with some of these other videos where we're going to start to use the camera. We're going to start to use some of these other things where we need to understand when things are happening in order to react accordingly. And again, I wanted to show you how to use log so that you can really use this to debug into the app and understand what's happening and all of that. All right. Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe and look for more videos.